everyone! So today we're going to be working on watercolor. And today is going to be more of an experimenting day. And it's lots of fun. So get out your paper and your paints and let's see what we can create. Watercolor is something that you want to kind of experiment and see what you can do with the paint. So I want to show you first, we're going to do wet on dry. And what that means is I have a dry piece of paper. And I am going to take my brush and dip it in the water. Get some of my paint. So I have the paints that are in the tubes, but you might have some that are actually in the blocks, which you can go in and just wet your brush and put your brush right on there and it'll work. So I'm going to show you on wet and dry is. So we're putting our paint on dry paper. And we want to see, this is pretty nice about keeping a nice sharp line. So I can kind of keep control of my paint a little bit. So I'm just going to keep going. Make it a bit of a square. There we go. So that is wet on dry. So I'm going to use a bit of a bigger brush just to show you what wet on wet means. So what that means is we are going to wet our piece of paper. So I'm just doing, you probably can't see, but I can kind of see the little bit of raised water on my paper. And we're going to take this still, and I'm going to go in with the same blue. So I'm going to kind of coat my paintbrush. I got to see where the wet part is on my paper. And I want you to watch how the color changes. Do you see how the color's kind of making up its mind on where it goes itself? So it's going to stay within that parameters of where I put the water, but it shows you how loose this kind of paint can be, how it's not as perfect as the wet on dry. So I'm going to show you a few different techniques when we're working on our paintings in the next couple weeks, and we're going to be doing wet on dry and wet on wet, and to see the changes that it does. So we're going to try a couple other things. And I want you to keep going. I want you to experiment with any color combinations. But we're going to look and see. I'm going to wet another square on my paper. So there's a little bit of water there. It's not to the point I make a huge puddle, but there's definitely some water. And then I'm going to go in with a light color, because you're going to want to learn about layering in watercolor. Because paint in watercolor is transparent. That's part of the magic of it. But it means that we can put darker colors on top. And I'm going to show you how. So this is wet on wet. So I'm going to just pull this paint through. And see how it kind of has its own rules that it's falling within the paint. And I can go in a little bit more. Show you. See, I put it a little bit thicker to see what happens. It's all about experimenting and finding out how this paint reacts to your paper and the amount of water content on there. So I wanted to show you about layering. So I'm going to do this quite quickly, but can we see that this is still wet? So we're going to go wet on wet paint. So I'm going to take like a pink and I'm going to lay that. It's like it makes just kind of a puddle of pink paint on my paper. So we're going to want to go back and see what all this is going to do when it's dry. And you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of lift my paper up. See how you can play with it a little bit. Oh, I love that. I love that color combination. So I want to see what kind of color combinations you guys get too. I want you to try different things today. This is all about experimenting. So do you remember what we did over here? It's dry. So this was wet on dry. So now what we want to do is we're going to try wet paint on dry paint and see what happens. See, we're going to use the same color combination. So this is on my wet on wet, and this is going to be wet on dry. And I want you to see how much more control I have. How when I put that paint down, it's like painting with acrylic closer, right? We can keep those lines. So sometimes you're going to want that, and sometimes you're not going to want that. And I'm going to show you a couple more experiments on this piece of paper, and then we're going to start talking about something else we can work on. So I want to put a big amount of wet paint. I want to put a big square. And you can use different pieces of paper. I want you to experiment as much as you can, because this is how we learn how to use watercolor. It's about experimenting and knowing how to use it before we go into a project. Okay, so I'm going to let's take pink this time. I really like that pink, so I'm going to take, and actually I think it kind of dabbled in a little bit with the red, but that's okay. So I'm going to put it on where it is wet. And I'm going to show you a really cool thing to do. I'm kind of going to make it washy, so I'm going to kind of go over it like that. One amazing thing to use is salt, and I'm going to show you why. So I'm going to pick up some of my salt with my fingertips. I don't want to contaminate my other ones, but I'm going to spread my salt all over that pink. And I want you to try that in a few different colors. So we're going to leave that because it needs to dry before we do anything else. And we're going to move on to our next color experiment. And what color are we going to use there? I think we're going to use, you know what, I'm going to get back into my navy blue. I really like that color too. I've already got it out here. The nice thing is watercolors is something you can take with you. I have just a jar I keep all my watercolors in, a little palette, and just some paper. And I'll take it places with me too. I like working on, so I'm going wet on dry, remember? And you can try wet on wet. Actually, I kind of made it wet on wet when I did the second bit. And I'm gonna take some saran wrap. So just the saran wrap you have in your drawer. I'm sure you can find a piece somewhere. We're gonna use saran wrap and we're gonna use foil. And I want you to smush it all together in a ball. And these lines are gonna be what we kind of want to see in our paint. So I'm gonna push this down on my paint. You can lay it over top really nicely, but we're going to let it dry. So we're not gonna lift this up yet. Same with the salt, we wanna let it do its work. And the very next experiment we're going to do, and then we're going to come back, talk some more when it's all dry. Oopsie, see how that's kind of... Okay, so let's try wet on wet. And remember, you can change up what you're doing. Just keep track of like the different kinds of effects. And we're going to try green this time because I have green out. Here we go. So wet on wet, I'm going to put my... Oh, isn't that beautiful? Oh, I love that color. I think it's my favorite one, and I'm not really a green person, but wow, that's beautiful. So I'm going to take a piece of aluminum foil, which we always seem to use in our acrylic paintings, but I'm going to take it like this, and I'm going to smush it up into a ball. And I'm going to unsmush it. Remember, this is all experiments. Sometimes those will work out exactly the way you think, and sometimes this is going to be, and I'm going to push it into the paint. And we're going to let that dry. Ooh, see? Kind of see what it's going to look like maybe, because it kind of, my finger got caught in the foil. There we go. So I'm going to go, and I'm going to come back when our experiments are dry, and then we're going to start on another one. I'll be right back. So I am going to show you the next experiment. So experiment number 2. And this is how I love to create skies. And I love landscapes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start wet on wet. So as we remember, I'm going to take my brush, and I dipped it in my water. It's my little teacup here. Oops. As I'm making a mess, and I guess that's part of painting. So I'm going to do this whole piece of paper because I want to show you how amazing this can be. So I'm going to go in with my blue. So I'm going to go in with my light blue because remember I said always start with your light colors. I'm going to go in and I'm going to need some more. And this is the thing about learning how to use this kind of paint. And if you're working on a project, I suggest, just like when we're doing acrylic, we tape it with some painter's tape to our board. but I'm kind of just having fun and experimenting today, so I have not done that. But it helps you so your paper doesn't curl and then it stays more in control. So I'm gonna keep going with this. And then I'm gonna go in with a darker blue. So I still want it wet on wet, so you gotta move a little bit quick just because of how we're working with our paint. And I'm going to move through the sky again, just kind of placing my darker blue. You can actually, I'm going to show you it really dark right at the top here. See how it's all transparent? So my color is kind of running into itself and making these cool patterns. I want to make it kind of dark just because, oh, I got a lot on there. Just because I'd like you to be able to see it. And I want it to be kind of dark so we can see these clouds. I'm gonna just keep working in the color, where usually I would kind of stop by now and start working in my clouds, but I want you to be able to see it at home. So I'm just working my way through. As you see, there's less paint on my brush at the bottom, right? So, okay. So it's still wet. And I'm going to show you, if you take a piece of paper towel and smush it up, you can create the most amazing clouds with that. You could even do some of the other experiments where I'm showing you on the other paper. So you could add some salt to the sky to give yourself some texture. It's kind of like a texture almost, right? Or you could add like a stain of another color, which actually I'm going to do in a minute. But if we see, this is the way I like to make my clouds. So I'll add some grays, and then I'll put some gray in my clouds, and then I will take my trusty paper towel and I will go in. I'm gonna kind of create this big cloud down here, which I really like. Perfect. And if you can kind of see, you can even get a little bit of texture from your paper towel. I think that kind of looks really cool. So I'm going to show you if we go in. So I'm just going to wet my paint a little bit, right? And then I'm going to add some of the darker paint. Remember what I said about adding wet on wet? Can kind of create some texture in my sky. Today's all about experimenting, so I want you to try filling up some paper with random things. So try wet on the dry, wet on wet. I just added a little bit of darker blue, and now I'm going to add salt. See what happens when it dries. Perfect. So I'm going to add a little bit more water over at the top here to kind of get my paint more runny again. And remember, when it gets runny, it gets a little out of control, right? And I'm going to take my salt and I'm going to pour it on. I love using salt. You can see I kind of have, there's a couple little pieces throughout. I'm going to do a little bit over here. And if your paint is dry, right, the salt is not going to mix, like it's not going to really do anything. You need to make sure that that paint is wet. Okay, so I am going to let this dry and I will be back. Hi, so I'm back with my first experiments and I wanted to show you what they look like. Because watercolor can look very different dry than it does wet. So I love this, how the saran wrap kind of puts in the texture, right? And then let's try the foil one. That's kind of cool. You can see it a little bit in here. I might, next time I think I would have put more paint, smushed it down a bit, but I want you to give that a try. And then the salt. Salt is one of my favorite things to use with watercolor. And I'm gonna show you some different stuff. It's still a little wet, but I'm gonna take a brush. Let's see if I can do this. The salt is quite stuck. And I'm gonna brush it off. I just wanted to give it a nice, ooh, and some of it was a little bit wet still right here. But I want to show you, see? I love that. I love the way the salt, you can see where the salt was laying. It actually like absorbed the watercolor. So it's amazing with texture. So we have wet on dry, wet on wet, wet on wet, and then another wet. The wet on wets with salt, saran wrap, and foil. So I want you to keep trying these with different colors and different color combinations, because we're gonna have to kind of be comfortable with the paint to do the project I have in store next week. So I'm gonna show you, oh, I think this is not totally dry yet. I'm gonna lay this just on top of here, but let's look and see what's happening. Actually, this is looking really cool. But I'm gonna let it keep drying and I'm gonna come back because I wanna brush all that salt off and show you what it created. And then maybe do one more level of the clouds. And then that's gonna be the experiments for today, and I want you to keep going with that. So I'll be back in just a couple minutes to show you what I got. Okay, so I'm back, and here is the salt experiment. So I want you to look at the places I put the least amount of salt. You can actually see where the salt was. It almost looks like little miniature snowflakes. And then these spots, I put quite a bit of water and lots of salt, and it just pulled all of that pigment right out. So it shows you that the different amounts of salt you use can really change the effect that you're going for. So what I'm gonna do is, we might as well, this is like calling for a landscape. And I want you to know landscapes do not have to be difficult at all. That's not what they're about. Sometimes they can be very like almost an abstract, right? I'm gonna put a little field down here. So that's wet on wet. I just took my wet paintbrush and put wet paint on top. And then let's make these clouds stand out a little bit. So I'm gonna go wet on wet again. So I'm gonna add just some water droplets to the clouds that I created out of my paper towel. And then I'm gonna pick up a little bit of black paint, but I don't want it black. I want it just like a hint of gray. So when you want a color to be lighter, we're just gonna add way more water and it dilutes that paint. So there's another experiment you just learned today. So just like I did with the pink on the blue, I'm just gonna kind of wet on wet, put some gray clouds in and see how it's creating some texture and some perspective to the clouds, that it looks like there's different layers to them, and I love it. So I'm gonna put a little bit more down here, and this is now wet on dry, and it just shows us that I can keep more control of my paint that way. So, because these are smaller clouds, right? Because they're in the horizon, so I don't want them to be gigantic, like wet on wet clouds like these top ones are. Okay, and I'm going to show you one little thing next. If I take my paint brush, oh, there's a little bit. Paint on that. Okay, so over here where it is dry, and make sure this time my paintbrush is nice and clean. I guess I wasn't careful enough. I'm going to add some water to it. And then I'm going to put that water on this piece of blue. And I just want to show you that I can take my brush, dry it really good so it soaks up the color. And do you see how then we can start playing with the color? I just made it a lot lighter, right? It's kind of the way to erase. If you don't like something, you wet it, dry your brush, and let your brush kind of absorb, almost use it as an eraser. Oh, I love that landscape. I think it looks beautiful. So that is our experiments for today. Next week is going to be a project. So I'd like you guys to try as many as you can. Let me know what you come up with and the different colors that you've tried. And let's meet up again next week. I'll talk to you later.